In the early 1950s, a small group of blacks moved into the Lawndale Gardens projects, and this sparked some racial outrage in the community. In 1950, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club opened their clubhouse at 25th and Rockwell in Little Village. Some young men in the neighborhood were bothered by this and formed their own club to battle the Outlaws, and they were called the Gaylords. There were many clashes over the decade between the Outlaws and the Gaylords. By the late 1950s, the Outlaws and Gaylords ran Little Village. The other gangs were just small greaser clubs that didn't have the manpower to oppose the two other gangs. The one thing the Outlaws and Gaylords agreed upon throughout the 1950s was to keep blacks out of the neighborhood. In the early 1960s, another racially motivated threat to the neighborhood arose when Mexican families began moving into Little Village. There was heavy objection to their arrival, and since Gaylords and Outlaws were successful in keeping blacks out of Little Village, they figured they would be equally as successful in keeping the Mexicans out too. Mexican teens were constantly being bullied and beaten by greasers, so bad that they formed the first Mexican gang in 1962 in Little Village at 24th and Marshall Boulevard in the Marshall Square section. White Sal created the Mar Kings. The name Mar Kings comes from the street name of Marshall Boulevard, basically saying they're the kings of Marshall Boulevard. This gang of Mexican teens fought white greaser clubs tooth and nail. The Mar Kings eventually laid claim to the territory at 24th and Marshall Boulevard. In 1964, the leader of the Imperial Street Gang sat down with the Mar Kings, and the leader of the Imperials proposed a merger. After the meeting, the Latin Kings were born. Now all Mar Kings became Latin Kings. The Little Village neighborhood was originally known as South Lawndale, but the name was changed in the mid-1960s to Little Village. But the Marshall Square section remained part of the Little Village neighborhood. You see, it was originally one neighborhood that was split into three smaller hoods. It is recognized as two, but it's really three. By the mid-1960s, the Gaylords were pushed out of the neighborhood. After the Gaylords left Little Village, it was mostly dominated by Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords. The Outlaw Motorcycle Club changed direction and decided to make money in the emerging drug trade. For the Outlaws, it wasn't about preserving the neighborhood anymore. It was about the dollar. By the end of the decade, white flight increased because more Mexican families started flooding into the area. And lack of employment and disappearing manufacturing jobs made this area less attractive to middle-class whites. And Czechs, Poles, and German residents began to flee to the suburbs. As white residents left, the meaning behind Little Village changed into a new identity as La Velita. The Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords dominated Little Village from the early 1960s throughout all of the 70s. New gangs would arrive and set up shop in Little Village, like the Latin Counts. They came from 18th Street. Then there's the Ambrose and Villalobos. But none would come close to equaling the size of the Latin Kings. Latin Counts moved into the Lawndale homes at the time many Mexican families were leaving. Eventually, Latin Counts left the projects, and Latin Kings, vice lords, and gangster disciples took over control of the projects. But the surrounding area was completely controlled by the Latin Kings. By the 1970s, gang warfare in Little Village were racially motivated feuds. But all this changed in the mid-1970s when the Medellin cartel started pushing weed and cocaine into the village. Gang wars from this point forward would be solely about making the dollars in the lucrative drug trade. Something else changed. Opposition came for the Latin Kings in the 1970s when the 2-6 organization took form. They became the Latin Kings' most ferocious rival. In the 1970s, 2-6 would gain more turf in western Little Village, mainly in the K-Town section. As 2-6 grew, they gunned for drug territory and attempted to mow down as many Latin Kings as possible. This sparked a vicious and very violent war. By the late 1970s, 2-6 was emerging as a larger gang, and this was when the Satan Disciples, 2-6, Ambrose, and the 2-2 Boys and Ridgeway Lords became allies. Ridgeway Lords were now at war with the Latin Kings. And by the early 1980s, the Ridgeway Lords began shrinking in numbers because of the war. And 2-6 was on a rampage, and they were exploding in numbers. After the decline of the Medellin cartel, a new Mexican drug cartel took the reins. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, founded the Guadalajara cartel in 1980 and controlled most of the illegal drug trade in Mexico and took over the cocaine routes from the Colombians. And Little Village was slated as a viable base for their drug operations. The 1980s is when the drug wars all started. The 80s and 90s were the most violent years on the streets of Little Village, mostly due to the back and forth violence between 2-6 and the Latin Kings. The real money started flowing into Little Village when El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel moved in the early 90s. The neighborhoods of Pilsen and Little Village, both are which about 82% Hispanic, became hubs for the Sinaloa cartel. In Chicago, the cartel has the monopoly. They moved nearly $6 billion worth of illegal narcotics from 1990 to 2008. The Flores twins were the pipeline connection that led directly to the Sinaloa cartel in Chicago's Little Village. They learned the cocaine trade at age 7 from their dope-dealing dad. By age 17, Margarito and Pedro Flores were jointly overseeing the mega-profitable cocaine franchise in Chicago on behalf of El Chapo. They were caught in 2008 and decided to turn against El Chapo. Between 2005 and 2008, Pedro Flores testified that he and his brother imported over 38 tons of cocaine and many other drugs from Chapo and his Sinaloa cartel. Now they're both in protective custody after they pled guilty to drug conspiracy charges, and they were sentenced to 14 years in prison. And El Chapo received a life sentence in July of 2019. The 80s and 90s were the most violent years on the streets of Little Village, mostly due to the back and forth violence between 2-6 and the Latin Kings. Little Village was often regarded as one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago. In the 21st century, the violence is toned down a bit, but this is still an area plagued with gang crime and is the poorest Mexican community in the city. By 2010, 2-6 and the Latin Kings suppressed other gangs to the point that they really couldn't claim any significant ownership of territory on the streets of Little Village. Villa Lobos, Ridgeway Lords, Sin City Boys, and the Gaylords had all been pushed out of this area, mainly because members have flipped to the 2-6 or Latin Kings. Little Village is the birthplace of the Southside Latin Kings, 2-6, Sin City Boys, and the Ridgeway Lords. The geographic location of the Little Village neighborhood is perfect for drug distribution. It is a gold mine because it's smack dab in the middle of all of Chicago's drug dealing gangs. The sheer amount of drugs moved out of Little Village over the years into the rest of the neighborhoods is staggering. And I have often said, if you control the drug trade, you control the streets of Chicago. These are the surrounding communities and gangs that inhabit them. To the south is Brighton Park. They have Black P-Stones, La Raza, Saints, Mafia Insane Vice Lords, Mickey Cobras, and C-Notes. To the east is the heart of Chicago and Pilsen, and they have Bishops, Four Corner Hustlers, Harrison Gents, Insane Dragons, Party People, Spanish Cobras, and Vice Lords. And to the north is North Lawndale, and they have Black Disciples, Black Souls, Conservative Vice Lords, Gangster Disciples, New Breeds, and Traveling Vice Lords. And to their back is the suburban township of Cicero. When the gangs throw down in Little Village, the firepower used is second to none. In 2017, the Little Village neighborhood was ranked 13th on the top 10 most violent neighborhoods list. And in 2017, 80 people were shot, 8 were killed, and 72 were wounded. And in 2018, they were ranked 10th. 90 people were shot, 9 were killed, and 85 were wounded. And in 2019, the neighborhood has seen a massive reduction in shootings and killings, and is now ranked 14th. 47 people have been shot, 7 have been killed, and 40 have been wounded so far this year, and there's still a ways to go yet. What you are about to see are a few of the many shootings I covered over the years in Little Village. Over the Labor Day weekend in 2017, 3 people were shot at 24th and Harding in the Village. 1 woman and 2 men were shot standing on the corner. A gray car pulled up and opened fire in this gang-related shooting. All 3 were listed in stable condition. And as you can see, tensions run high after violent events like this. On September 4th of 2017, a woman was shot in a drive-by shooting in the Little Village neighborhood. She was taken away in stable condition. She was standing on the corner with 4 other people when she was shot. She was not the intended target. The shooters are still at large. When you look at the faces of people on these crime scenes, it makes you wonder if they're prisoners in their own neighborhoods.
All right, we got a guy shot in Little Village on Whipple. I'm heading over there now.
On Christmas Day 2018, a man was shot while walking down the sidewalk. He was approached by someone on foot, and the shooter opened up on the man. A whole hell of a lot of shots were fired in this incident. He was struck in the upper body and later died at the hospital. There were no witnesses to this shooting. The only witness was the man that was shot and the camera pod on the pole. And the shooter is still out there. You see, the violence in Chicago never takes a holiday. On August of 2019, a teen boy was shot at 24th and St. Louis while sitting in the front seat of a car. A shooter took aim at the car, fired shots, and one of the bullets came crashing through the back window. The bullet struck the teen in the head. The car came to a stop blocks away at Cermak in California. He was pulled from the car by paramedics and taken by ambulance to Mount Sinai, where he later died. He was identified, his name, William Granados, age 16. And this is another young man that won't be attending school after the long summer vacation. The shooter is still on the loose, and I have a feeling this shooting won't go unpunished by some in the village. In August of 2019, a 34-year-old man was shot while riding a bicycle on the 2400 block of South Sawyer in the Little Village neighborhood. The shooter in a silver Nissan opened fire, striking the man multiple times in the body. He was taken to Mount Sinai in serious condition, and a lot of shots were fired in this incident, and no shooter is in custody as of yet. In June of 2018, 4 people were shot in the Little Village neighborhood. The group was standing on the street on the 2200 block of South Sacramento when a shooter appeared. He was in all black. He walked up and fired a dozen shots at the group on the corner. 1 woman and 3 men were wounded, 2 critically. This shooting was gang-related, and the shooter is still at large. On the morning of August 6, 2018, a call came over the radio. And this was the type of call you don't want to go to, because it's so tragic. It happened in the Little Village neighborhood at about 3:45 a.m. A fire broke out in a 3-story structure on the 2200 block of South Sacramento. Flames were reported by neighbors, and the fire department was called. And when they arrived, they put the fire out and immediately found 8 kids dead. 2 were still alive and rushed to Stroger Hospital, and over the next couple of days, they lost the battle for life. And both of them died. These are the names and ages of the children and teens that perished in this tragic fire. Amaya Alvarez, 3 months old. Alani Alaya, 3 years old. Gianni Alaya, 5 years old. Ariel Garcia, 5 years old. Giovanni Alaya, 10 years old. Xavier Contreras, 11 years old. Nathan Contreras, 13 years old. Adrian Hernandez, 14 years old. Cesar Contreras, 14 years old. And Victor Mendoza, 16 years old. The investigation by the Chicago Fire Department found that there were no working smoke detectors, and the fire was the result of a smoldering item in the back of the apartment. And at 3:45 in the morning, no adults were present in the apartment at the time. The Chicago Department of Buildings found over 40 violations in the 2 buildings. The owner of the apartment, 80-year-old landlord Merced Gutierrez, was blamed for the fire because of the many violations. After the fire, the Chicago Fire Department handed out smoke detectors to the neighborhood while raising awareness of their importance. I sat and watched for over an hour as the family showed up on the scene. I observed cops, firemen, paramedics, and they all had one thing in common: the look of extreme sadness I can't quite explain to this day. It is by far the worst tragedy I have ever covered in Chicago to date. The Little Village neighborhood is called Mexico of the Midwest by many. After white flight occurred, the people of Little Village completely rebuilt their economy in a very short period of time, and made 26th Street the second highest grossing shopping district in the city. In 2015, the 2 Mile Business District created $900 million in sales. Its contender, Michigan Avenue, made approximately $1.8 billion the same year. The arch entrance to Little Village was built in 1990 and was designed by Mexican architect Adrian Lozano. And in 1991, the Mexican government donated a bronze clock for the arch entrance to the Little Village neighborhood. An average family's income in the village is about $32,000 a year. It is one of the poorest Hispanic neighborhoods in the city, but you wouldn't know it because most of the homes are well kept, and there are a few abandoned buildings and a lot of graffiti scars of wars past that can be seen throughout the neighborhood. but overall it is one of the most community-oriented and self-sufficient neighborhoods out of the top 20. The buildings and businesses are very old, but have a lot of character. There are a couple little factories and some industry tucked back in the interior. And Little Village has one of the biggest collections of mural wall art in the city. It's pretty cool driving around looking at it. I would like to leave you with these final thoughts. The old neighborhood way of life is still alive and well in Little Village. It is one of the few neighborhoods that preserve the old neighborhood way of life in Chicago. I love the open-air markets where you can mingle with the residents and vendors up and down the 2-mile strip. Going there always brings me back to my childhood. It was always a treat when my mom would take us shopping down the 26th Street strip. Another thing, there are a lot of old churches, and I get the impression by the large amount of churches and religious street art throughout this community, it tells me they are very religious, and this is a community that has not abandoned their churches and their faith. Some people fear driving through or shopping in this neighborhood because of the violence. I don't think civilians have anything to fear, because for the most part, the gang violence is mainly confined to gang member on gang member. I go there and eat and never had a problem in over 30 years. They have great Mexican food, the most authentic in the city, and there are a lot of places to choose from, and they also have the best bakery products. It's surely worth the trip to me. The population of Little Village in the 1930s was around 76,000, and in 2015 the population is at 74,000. This is one of the very few of the old neighborhoods that has kept its population over the past 80 years. And part of the reason for this is undocumented immigrants have been flocking to the village from Mexico for over 40 years. Chicago has claimed sanctuary status for the people of Little Village and Chicago. Illinois and the city of Chicago are presently battling the federal government on this most heated issue. In 2017, the Little Village neighborhood was ranked 13th on Hey Jackass's top 15 most violent neighborhoods in Chicago. And in 2018, they jumped up to 10th. And so far in 2019, they are ranked 14th. 47 people have been shot, 7 have been killed, and 40 have been wounded so far this year. But the good news is, there has been a significant decrease in shootings and killings in Little Village this year. I have ranked Little Village 11th on the all-time list of most violent neighborhoods in Chicago. I would like to leave you with this final thought. The people of the village are serious about religion and are one of the few neighborhoods that have not abandoned the family structure. And that's why I hold out hope for the people of Little Village.